Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is food that did not exist 3 months ago. A banana from a warm country, milk from a fridge that never stops running, bread baked yesterday. You barely think about it. Winter changes nothing for you, but for almost all of human history, winter changed everything. And the way your ancestors solved that problem is stranger and smarter than most people realize. You might assume the answer is simple. Ancient humans starved a little, ate less, and waited for spring. That is the story most documentaries tell. But it is not quite true. The real answer is that surviving winter was not about toughing it out in the cold months. It was about what you did months before the cold even arrived. Winter was not a problem you solved in winter. It was a problem you solved in autumn. Picture a small group of people living somewhere in Ice Age Europe around 20,000 years ago. By late summer, the days are already shortening, the herds are moving, and everyone in the group knows, without needing to say it out loud, that the next few months will decide whether they live or die. So what do they actually do? The first thing is fat, not meat. Fat. This is one of the most counterintuitive facts about ancient diets. You might picture a caveman tearing into a giant slab of lean meat like a prehistoric steak dinner. But lean meat alone is almost useless for survival. In fact, it can be dangerous. There is a well-documented condition called protein poisoning, sometimes nicknamed rabbit starvation. Arctic explorers in the 19th and 20th centuries experienced it firsthand when they tried to live on lean rabbit meat alone. Within days, they felt weak, nauseous, and exhausted no matter how much they ate. The anthropologist John Speth has spent decades studying this phenomenon in the archaeological record, and his research helped overturn the old assumption that more meat simply meant more food. Your liver can only process so much protein before it becomes toxic. Without enough fat or carbohydrates alongside it, your body essentially starts poisoning itself. So for ancient humans, the real prize during a hunt was never the muscle meat. It was the fat, bone marrow, organ fat, the fatty tissue around the kidneys. These were the calories that could actually keep you alive through a long winter, and they were often eaten first, sometimes even before the meat was cooked. Now here's where it gets interesting. How do you make fat last for months with no freezer, no fridge, no electricity? The answer is one of the oldest food technologies in the world, rendering and mixing. Across many cold climate cultures, from Ice Age Europe to the indigenous peoples of North America thousands of years later, there is a strikingly similar solution. Fat is slowly melted down, then combined with dried pounded meat and sometimes dried berries. The result is a dense, energy-packed mixture that can be stored for months without spoiling. Among Plains nations in North America, this food is known as pemmican, and ethnographic accounts describe it lasting for years if kept dry and cool. The science behind why this works is simple but elegant. Fat is incredibly calorie-dense, more than double the calories per gram compared to protein or carbohydrates. Drying meat removes the water that bacteria need to grow. Combine the two and you have created essentially an ancient energy bar. Engineered through trial and error over countless generations, long before anyone understood the word calorie. But fat and dried meat were not the whole story. Winter survival also depended heavily on something most people never think about: the ground itself. Cold ground is a natural freezer, and ancient humans figured this out early. Archaeological sites across Siberia, Northern Europe, and the Arctic show evidence of food storage pits, sometimes lined with bark, stone, or moss, dug into permanently frozen or seasonally frozen soil. Meat killed in a single successful hunt in autumn could be packed into these pits and effectively frozen solid for months. Some indigenous Arctic communities still use similar underground caches today, a direct continuation of a strategy that may be tens of thousands of years old. This single fact reframes how we should picture the hunt. It was not a daily event. A successful large animal hunt in early autumn, say of a mammoth, bison, or reindeer, could provide enough stored food to carry a small group through several months of winter. The hunt was not about today's dinner, it was about an entire season. Now what about plants? Surely everything green disappears in winter? Mostly yes, but not entirely, and ancient humans were remarkably good at finding what remained. Roots and tubers dug from frozen or near-frozen ground stored well into winter. Nuts, particularly ones with hard shells like hazelnuts, pine nuts, and acorns, could be gathered in massive quantities in autumn and stored dry for months. Archaeological sites in places like Israel and across Europe show huge concentrations of charred hazelnut shells dating back tens of thousands of years. evidence of deliberate, large-scale collection and storage, not casual snacking. Some plant foods were even processed in ways that feel surprisingly modern. Acorns, for instance, contain bitter tannins that make them unpleasant and even harmful raw. But soaking or leaching them in water removes the tannins, leaving behind a starchy food that can be ground into flour. This is not a simple discovery. It requires understanding a problem, testing a solution, and repeating a multi-step process reliably enough to pass it down. In other words, it required culture. There is also the question of fermentation, something that connects ancient winter survival directly to your own kitchen today. Fermented foods, whether fish buried and left to slowly break down, or dairy products turned into something closer to yogurt or cheese, served two purposes. They preserved food for longer, and they made certain nutrients easier for the body to absorb. Some researchers studying Arctic and subarctic diets have noted that fermented fish, while it might sound unappetizing to modern noses, was often a critical source of vitamins during the darkest months when fresh produce was non-existent and sunlight and the vitamin D it helps the body produce was scarce. This brings us to one of the strangest pieces of evidence we have, a single frozen body. In 1991, hikers in the Alps discovered the remains of a man who died over 5,000 years ago, now known as Ötzi the Iceman. His body was so well preserved by ice that researchers could examine the contents of his stomach. What they found was not a single primitive food, but a surprisingly varied last meal: fatty meat from wild animals, cereal grains, and traces of plants. It was, in its own way, a balanced winter meal: fat for energy, grains for sustained calories, plants for micronutrients, eaten by someone walking through a frozen mountain landscape thousands of years before written history. So if you put all of this together, a picture emerges that is very different from the caveman gnawing on a bone cliché. Surviving winter was not about endurance. It was about preparation, planning, and chemistry, even if no one called it chemistry. Rendering fat, drying meat, leaching tannins from acorns, burying fish to ferment, digging pits into frozen ground. Every one of these is a small piece of technology, refined and passed down, that turned a season of scarcity into something survivable and sometimes even comfortable. And here is the part that connects directly back to you. That craving you get in winter, the pull toward rich, warm, fatty, calorie-dense food, comfort food, is not a modern weakness or a lack of willpower. It is an extremely old signal. For most of human history, that craving kept people alive. Bodies that craved fat and stored it efficiently were the bodies that made it to spring. Bodies that did not, often did not. You inherited that craving. You just inherited it into a world where the freezer is always full, the thermostat never breaks, and winter for you changed nothing at all. Except somewhere underneath all of that convenience, your body still remembers a time when it did.